my channel. I'm Stacey Aldridge LCSW, and I started this YouTube channel to share some of my thoughts and feelings and interests when it comes to improving your mental health. So I have my series, Your Mindfulness Minute, that I hope that you've gotten to take a look at, and those are daily videos that you can follow along each day with something that challenges you to step outside your comfort zone or to be more mindful in a simple, easy way to integrate that mindfulness into your everyday life. But then in these longer videos, we talk about different subjects, random stuff that I feel like talking about, or that you can request if you have something in particular that you would like for me to talk about or you would like to learn more about. Leave a comment and let me know, because I am definitely open to suggestions. That's kind of how I choose group therapy topics. If I see that there is a theme, then I kind of go and talk about that. So I'm pretty open. But today I want to talk to you about grief and grieving. And it's funny in a sad way that I actually chose to talk about this topic before a good friend of mine texted me that her cat had passed away. And you know, grief is a funny thing, because when I talk to people about grief, I first start off by asking, what do we grieve about? What are some things that we grieve? And people are often very quick to point out that not only do we grieve the death of humans, but we grieve the death of our beloved pets. But we get really fixated with death too, not necessarily in a bad way, but we associate grieving with death. But grieving is actually a natural reaction to any great loss. So there are a lot of losses that have absolutely nothing to do with death or dying. And when I am in a group setting and I have a whiteboard, I like to write. And I ask people just to call out, what are some situations where you lose something? What is something you have lost or could lose? And then we start to brainstorm all of the different things, like you can lose a job. You can lose a relationship. Certainly, we grieve the loss of relationships, even if the person is not dead. Maybe there is a breakup or a divorce or a falling out. And it's a very similar grief process, even though that person is not dead, but perhaps they're just inaccessible to us. We can lose friends in other ways, such as a move across the country. We can lose, don't know if I said a job, you know, maybe you're fired or your company closes or you're laid off, and there's a grief process that goes along with that. But the really interesting and funny part about grief is that we actually, and oftentimes do, have a grief process about things that are not necessarily bad or stereotypically bad things. And I mentioned this just a minute ago when I said we could lose a friend or a loved one to a move. One thing that most people are familiar with is the empty nest syndrome, where we have a child who grows up, which is a great thing. You know, we want our children to grow up, because what's the alternative? But eventually, your child gets to the point where they're ready to go out into the world. Maybe they're going to college. Maybe they're moving out of the house. Maybe they are starting a job. You know, the world is open to them and they're excited. And you're excited too, because, you know, you've grown this person into a functioning member of society. And maybe you're really excited about having your food and energy costs go down when they're not in the house anymore. But you also have a sadness of knowing that that adult human being will never be a child again, never be a baby again. And so you grieve, and that's okay. But it's because of a situation that is ultimately good or positive. So there are many situations where we do have a very similar grief process. We don't always acknowledge that we are grieving. One of the interesting things about doing therapy is that many times people come in with unresolved grief, and I can't even begin to count the number of times that someone has said to me, it's been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years since this happened. I don't understand why I'm still upset about this. That's stupid. That was a long time ago. And they beat themselves up because so much time has passed. How could they possibly still be upset about this situation or this loss? Or, my father died 30 years ago. How could I still be upset about this? And what they don't realize, because we don't talk about it very much, is that grief and grieving is an active process. So it requires something from us. It is not something that happens necessarily organically. So time passing doesn't matter, because if you haven't grieved a loss, that loss is still there. It's tangible. It's part of your life. Hey, even if you have grieved the loss, that loss is often still tangible and part of your life. But one of the things that stumps a lot of people is that we hear that time heals. So we expect that we will be healed after a certain amount of time. But that is not necessarily the case. I remember a very specific situation with a patient, a client, who said, well, it's been 20 years since my father passed away, so I don't understand how I could possibly still be upset about that. And I said, well, what happened in those 20 years? What all did you do? And they said, well, I got married, I had children, I was finishing up a degree, so I was going to school, and I was working, and I was raising my kids, and I had this marriage, and and you go to church, and the kids have soccer, and all of this stuff happens. And I'm like, well, you spent 20 years being really busy, focusing on a lot of things that had nothing to do with the loss of your father. So then when finally the kids go away, and you're not as busy, and there's not as much time and stuff going on, here comes that grief back saying, hi, you never really dealt with me. Guess who? And it's really frustrating if people say, I dealt with this. But how did you deal with this? Well, I cried, and then 20 years passed. It would be nice if it were that easy. But unfortunately, it's not always. Because remember, you're dealing with a significant loss. This is not the loss of a pair of sunglasses. This is something or someone that was significant to you. And therefore, it can't just go away in a very simple, easy way. That's really annoying. But that's life. So one of the things that everybody's familiar with, and this has gotten into pop culture, this has gotten into the cultural vernacular, everybody's familiar with the stages of grief. Some people, if you've taken a psychology course, then you could just rattle those things off. I often forget one of the 5 stages, but typically people will be like, oh no, denial, anger. See, I can't even name them off. I have my little cheat sheet here. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So this is something that a lot of people are familiar with. And what we do is we say, okay, well, I got angry. And then I was in denial. And I don't really understand what that bargaining thing is, but I'm sure I did it. And then I was depressed, obviously, because I cried and I was upset. And then I accepted it. So now, I don't understand why I'm still upset, because I accepted it. I've been through the stages, done with that, moving on, checked them off the list, Done, 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 done. But the tricky part about grief is that we don't go through those stages in that order necessarily. And it's not a linear process. So we can bounce around through those stages. And we can get through denial and get angry and go back to denial. We can be depressed through the whole thing. And it's so frustrating. And people get upset about it. And it is frustrating because we want for these feelings to go away. Nobody wants to feel bad. I don't like feeling bad. We don't want these unpleasant feelings, but we don't know what we have to do, this is what's frustrating, because people know the stages of grief, but nobody talks about how do you grieve. How do you grieve? You cry, and that's it. You cry and you go to a funeral, but we don't have funerals for kids going to college. We don't have funerals for a job you got laid off from. So what do you do besides crying to work through grief? I'm going to have a lot of resources for you guys, and they're all going to be down in the description box. Lots of links, because one of the things that we do to grieve actively is to actually work through some stuff, and journaling. If you've ever been in therapy, if you've ever read any self-help books, you know that journaling is something that we talk about a lot, because it's a way of getting our feelings out on paper in a safe space. So if you can't go to therapy, or maybe you can't be in therapy, well, you definitely can't be in therapy 24 hours a day, but what you can do is pick up a notebook and write down how you feel. And I have a sheet that I love to give people, and I do not take credit for this at all. I found this from Psychology Tools. It is based on Warden's Tasks of Mourning from 1991, so it's not quite as hasn't been around quite as long as those stages of grief. But the tasks of grief, he says, are to accept the reality of the loss. So what we've done is we've gone through those stages that we're familiar with, and we get to that acceptance. But now there's more accepting. We don't just accept the loss. Yes, I know that my loved one is dead. I know that I no longer have a job. I know that my kid decided to go to college in Antarctica. Whatever. Accepting means that it's reality. So we're saying, yes, I know that person is dead and never coming back. I know my child will never be a baby again. And really taking that to heart. So we're saying, this is our new reality. It's different. Maybe I don't like it, but this is reality now. And then this is the kicker. This is the one everybody hates. We must experience the pain of the loss. So not just crying. You have to feel bad to move on from grief. And this is where we get stuck. This is where 90% of people, I dare say, get stuck because we don't want to feel bad. You said, I cried, got over it, moved on, la 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 la. But 20 years later, we're still dealing with this. So what happened? You still feel bad because you stopped at the pain. Sometimes we feel like the pain is so overwhelming that if we really feel it, it will literally, physically kill us. It's too much. And I'm not saying that you have to feel every single bad feeling of that loss right at that moment, because it is a process. But what grief asks for us to do is, when that pain comes to us, it asks that we acknowledge it and that we sit with it, and that we not do all of the things that human beings love to do to make us forget that we are in pain. It asks that we don't turn on the television and binge watch Netflix. It asks that we don't, eat a gallon of ice cream to try to forget. It asks that we don't go have some drinks or, God forbid, do some drugs. And it asks that we don't stay so busy, that we get so physically exhausted that we just can't process and feel that pain. Because all we're doing with all of those processes is we are postponing the grieving process. You will feel the pain. You can feel it now or you can feel it later. But the difference is if we wait 20 years to really process that, we also have that added bonus of beating ourselves up about it because we feel like too much time has passed and we should be over it by now. So who decides how long it takes to grieve? Nobody. You don't get to decide. I wish I got to decide for you. Your therapist doesn't get to decide. Nobody gets to decide. Perhaps you could say that God decides. But the point is that there's no time frame. Nobody can tell you it'll take 2 weeks, it'll take 2 years. You know, I remember, I think it was from Sex and the City, perhaps, the television show, where one of the characters said it takes exactly half the amount of time you dated someone to get over the loss of that relationship. But the point is that nobody gets to decide, yourself included. It takes as long as it takes. So we get stuck at that experiencing the pain of loss because we don't want to feel bad. And we never truly move on from that pain because you can't move on if you don't go through it. The way out is through. So experience the pain of loss. That is that second task of grief. And then you must adjust to the new environment without whatever it is. So you've accepted the reality and now you're adjusting to that reality of I'm a single person now because I'm divorced, or I'm a widower, or I am a parent without a child because my child has hopefully gone away to college, but perhaps they have passed away. And so whatever that new reality is, however painful and horrible and however you never thought that you would be this person, it doesn't matter because you don't have control over that. And this is reality. So you have to adjust to this reality, even if it is the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. No wonder we don't process grief. Because how awful is that? Yes, I have to accept that I am now a widow because my husband died. I am now a widower because my partner died. I don't want that to be reality, so I'm not going to adjust to that. No. But then what happens is you get stuck. You know, I remember so many stories of wonderful people, and part of the reason I feel like talking about grief is so important that I chose to talk about it as the second video that I made is that even when people didn't come to see me for grief, they came to see me for grief. So many people were stuck in grieving. But then the people that did come for complicated grief, the stories that I could tell you would just break your heart and make you cry. And I remember someone who had lost a very close person to them, and it had been a year or two, so it was not a very new loss. Said the weather is getting colder, and I know that it's not rational, but I want to take a blanket to the graveyard and put it on the grave because I don't want for this person to be cold. And sometimes we know that it's not rational, but worrying about a deceased person being cold is in part a refusal to adjust to an environment where that person is no longer here. And it hurts. So we don't want to adjust to that new world because that hurts, but then non-adjusting hurts us too. And then the last task of grief is that we must reinvest in this new reality that we've accepted, with this facet being gone. So you lose your spouse of 35 years, of 50 years. The numbers just boggle my mind. I have had clients who were dealing with the loss of a spouse who they had been married to for longer than I had been alive. And that is a humbling experience, because you can't say to that person that you understand, because you don't and you can't. But what you have to do is invest in the new reality where that chapter in your life is closed and over and gone and done with. So you can't just say, yes, I know that my husband Bob is dead. But you have to start doing the things that you have to do, like going back to church or celebrating Christmas, or all of those things that we just want to put off because we're like, oh, I don't want to have to do it. I haven't been feeling good. I've been crying. I've been upset. And now I have to get back to living my life, because you're still alive. And now you need to have a life. I have seen that this is most difficult on people who have been caregivers, who have been taking care of a family member who has been chronically ill, sometimes for decades. And it's often a spouse, but not always. Sometimes it's a child or a niece or a nephew. And when you're caring for someone who is chronically ill, that person is the center of your world. And you stop doing the things that you would normally do. You're not going to go see a movie in the theater because what if they need me? Your life begins to revolve around that person. I have had people say, every time I leave the house, I have to pay a nurse or a caregiver aide to come and sit with my loved ones. So every time I leave the house, that is actually costing me money. Or it's just the simple guilt factor. How could I go and have fun doing this event when my loved one is stuck at home and can't? So little by little, people give up every bit of their hobbies and their outside interests and the things that they would leave the house to do. And after 10 years, even after 2 years, you start to forget, what were those things that I liked to do so much? And now is your opportunity to look back on what were my hobbies, what did I like doing outside of the home, and to begin to do those things again, because it can be really tough if you haven't done them in so long to even remember what those things were. Maybe you like going out to a gym. Maybe you stopped attending church functions. Maybe you would like to take some night classes and finish that degree. Or maybe you just want to learn something new. All of those things that do have to take place outside the home. So reinvesting in that new reality. If we're dealing with a divorce, reinvesting in the new reality can mean beginning to date again, which people often have difficulty with. Maybe just putting up an online dating profile. Maybe just being open to the idea of dating. But what we are doing is investing in this new, different reality, because this is your life. This is life. Like it or not, after a loss, we do continue living. And we want to live in a real, tangible way, not just as a shell of a person, not as a person lost in grief, but as a person who is reinvesting in their life. See, we don't talk about these tasks of grief very much at all in popular culture. So we don't push the message, which I wish that we could, that grief requires action. No, that really grieving. Grief is the feeling, but grieving, to move through it, to go through in order to get out, requires us to be proactive and feel the pain and do the hard things. The way out is through. And that's why we get stuck. That's why we get stuck. So one of my favorite resources as a therapist is the Center for Clinical Interventions, which is actually out of Australia. They have these wonderful courses that you can take handouts from, which I absolutely have. And you can give those to people, but you can also work through them as a self-help program. So if you're interested in that, I will have lots of links for this video of different resources, but in their segment on grief and bereavement, they talk about complicated grief. Now, processing grief is complicated, but from a clinical standpoint, we do say that there is complicated grief. That is grief that does persist for 20 years. You know, we will feel that loss and we will feel that pain, but if you're still stuck back there, then possibly you're dealing with complicated grief. And they have a little checklist that I wanted to share. It's difficult to define. They do point out, they have this in bold, because there is no standard which limits what is normal or healthy for grief. It's different for everyone. It's different for every situation. And that's what makes it tough. But they do have some things to look for. So you can look for this in yourself. You can look for this in your loved one who is grieving if you're concerned about them. First, pushing away that pain and avoiding the grief process entirely. That person who didn't cry, who hasn't cried. Refusing to attend the funeral. That could be that denial, stuck there. This isn't really happening. See, we also, and I didn't talk about this, and I should, we tend to think that denial means you say that, I don't believe that they're dead. I think he's just at the grocery store. And that is a kind of denial. But oftentimes, the denial that I see is not the, oh, you know, Uncle Bob's not really dead, he's just at the grocery store. It's the feeling of unreality, of disbelief. Like, I can't believe that this is true. I can't believe that this is happening. That is the denial that I see most often, because we're, you know, intelligent people. We're in touch with reality. We know, hey, Uncle Bob is dead, but it's that feeling of, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel real. How could this be possible? I saw him last week. He was fine. That is what we talk about when we talk about the denial phase of grief. So excessive avoidance of talking about or reminders of the person who has died. Maybe they go through and instead of clinging to that person's items and keeping all the photos out, they immediately get rid of all that person's things and take all the photos. And maybe you find the photos in the trash. So avoiding it to the point that maybe they're acting like that person didn't exist. You know, we're talking about the warning signs of complicated grief now. Using distracting tasks to avoid experiencing the grief, including planning the funeral. You know, that person that didn't cry because there was too much to do? I've got to call the pastor and I've got to get the funeral home on the phone and I need to see if he had a will. Did he make plans? Who knows the combination to the safe to see what song did he want played? You know, he always said he didn't want Amazing Grace. What was that song he wanted played? And they stay so busy The next thing would be abusing drugs and alcohol, including prescription drugs. So maybe, Uncle Bob has passed on and Aunt Jane has gotten a prescription for Xanax from her family doctor because she just can't stop crying. But maybe she's just taking those every waking moment and the crying has stopped and she just seems like a zombie. That could be a sign that she's stuck in complicated grief and is not really going through that process. Increased physical complaints or illness. You see this a lot with children. Anybody that has children or has worked with children, we know, my stomach hurts. They express feelings in physical sensations a lot, but this can happen with adults as well. Maybe you just have a headache that won't go away, or this fatigue that is, you just feel tired all the time, I don't know. It could be related to grief. And lastly, increased mood swings or isolation, and it says 1 to 2 months from the loss. So if you stop leaving the house after your husband of 35 years dies, that might be normal in the beginning, but 2 months later, if Aunt Jane is refusing to leave the house, then perhaps something's going on there that we need to look at more deeply. Now, at any point in the grieving process, you can see a professional. Obviously, as a mental health professional, a therapist, a counselor, I am a big encourager of people in going to therapy. And it's not because it's my job. It's because I know that it works. People say, oh, I've got friends to talk to. I don't need to go to a therapist. But eventually, our friends and our loved ones become fatigued, especially if they're dealing with the loss too. You might feel like you're imposing upon them in talking to them. And what a professional does is provide a safe space with no judgment, where you can say whatever you think and feel, and you never have to worry that it's going to be held against you or that it's going to get back to people. So, this person is bound by professional ethics and laws, okay? Laws to not tell people what you've said. And it won't get back to that gossip down the street who always knows everybody's business, so you can feel safe. We take our work very seriously. The helping field is a calling as much as a vocation. So yes, I believe in therapy because I'm a therapist. I believe in therapy because I have been in therapy. Every therapist will tell you that a good therapist needs their own therapist because we can't go home and talk about what happened. So we have to have a confidential space sometimes to unburden ourselves. So we understand because we've been there. So if your grief does not go away, don't be afraid to seek professional help. It's necessary sometimes. It does not mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're mentally ill. Just because you're depressed, it doesn't mean that you have major depression. It could be that you're stuck in grief. But there are lots of things that you can do. The last thing that I know specifically I'm going to put in the comment, in the description box, although I may put other stuff too if I find some other stuff that I feel like would be a good resource for you, even though I haven't specifically mentioned it. And I do have a lot. Hey, my clients are familiar with my binders. So I have lots of resources. And I like that because I can't remember everything, if nothing else, but I like to have handouts too, and I give handouts. And there is a journaling on grief, 2 actually. I'm going to put them both down here, so if you're interested in journaling, and this is not something that I push, if you're not interested in journaling, don't journal. Some people love it, some people hate it. That's okay too. You can actually take these questions and talk to a friend about them. Talk to your therapist about them. So it doesn't have to be written down. You can talk on, if you prefer talking and you don't have a therapist or a friend that you trust, use the recording on your phone. I'm sure Androids have them too. I have an iPhone, but I'm sure Androids have them. Record yourself and listen to it. So 2 sheets, journaling on grief, and you don't have to write it down. You can talk to yourself in your head, whatever you need to do. But grief is universal in that everyone, literally every person, is going to lose something significant to them. Everyone experiences grief. So these are just some tips on what you can do to grieve and go through that process. Well, I'm here to tell you what to do step by step, because that's what I think is important. Is people tell us the stuff, but they don't tell us how to do it. We need to know how to do it. A lot of times we want to grieve, but we're like, what am I supposed to do besides crying? Tell me. I don't know. I need help. And that's why professionals exist. And that's why these wonderful resources are out there, and they are free. But sometimes you do need to sit face to face with a trained professional. So I do encourage you to really look at your grief if you're feeling stuck. And if you feel like you need additional help, don't be afraid to reach out and get it. Thanks for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hate to say it, but grief is one of my favorite things to talk about. And not that I enjoy that people grieve, but in that I know that we've all been there and we will all probably be there again. It really is something that everybody experiences. So I hope that you found some helpful things in this video, and I hope that you check out those resources from the description box, because these are the things that I have found most helpful in my practice. If you like this, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button and hit the bell next to it so you actually get a notification when I post. Just subscribing will not give you a notification every time there's a new video. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called